In 2018, I was like so many conservatives, pretty darn libertarian, pretty darn free market above all. I measured progress almost completely in material terms. I'm an engineer and a businessman. And I was supportive of America using its military might to release those American ideals around the world. But I will say I was also always been more deferential to blue collar than elite collar, and very proud. I'm very proud of my country. And like most conservatives, I looked away for about 10 minutes in history. Suddenly, the alphabet mafia had taken over. DEI, ESG, LGBTQ, CRT, ETC, ETC. I think the left uses up so much language that it has to turn all of its mantras into acronyms, just because otherwise it'd run out of its considerable breath. It's so sobering, though, to watch American hard and soft power being used to advance wrong-headed ideas around the world. It makes you think, doesn't it? Let's clean up our own house and then have some more humility about all the other houses. I heard the phrase this week that what we're doing is recovering what conservative has been from what it has become, which is, I think, a great way of thinking about it for so many people like myself and for Senator. It's similar to the sentiments expressed by Senator Vance tonight. It's something very simple and common sense conservatism, with respect for faith, family, tradition, and nation, those things that hold us together, and defense against the enemies of those things. And it's restraint toward other nations and engaging with their own tortuous paths toward peace and prosperity. 2018 was a very important year generally in the rediscovery of conservatism as both nationalist and grounded in essential social and religious tradition. For me, it was the year I read Yoram's work and went woke in my own reverse kind of way. Yeah, on August 18th, 2018, Wall Street Journal published an op-ed called The Liberty of Nations. And probably many of you have recognized that. Kind of turned me on to Yoram. I ordered The Virtue of Nationalism, which created a stir when it was published in September of 2018. Bought a bunch of the books and gave them to everybody that I knew. And perhaps in response to what was in the air on October 23rd of that year, we heard this from a different end of the polemical spectrum than Yoram's end of the polemical spectrum. Quote, at a rally in Houston, according to the New York Times, Donald Trump embraced the term nationalism as unabashedly as he ever has. Really, we're not supposed to use that word, he told supporters in a nod to the usual political sensibilities that he relishes disrupting. You know what I am? I am a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. I'm a Texan, not a New Yorker, sorry. Nationalist, use that word. Use that word. This is kind of like what would become NatCon's version of say his name. Donald Trump had again kind of farted in church. I don't have to remind you how shocked the press was in its reactions to this use of this dangerous word. Then the hand of fate seems to sometimes display itself. Yoram came to visit me in Austin, and I took him down to meet Kevin Roberts, then executive director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and now, as you all know, the executive director of Heritage. Who could have guessed what would be in store? And that one day Heritage would lead the nationalist way and lead Heritage in such an important direction. But in our early discussions, before any of that was even considered, the language was so tenuous that there was an early debate within ultimately the NatCon group about the very word nationalism. Some of us were thinking, can't you tone it down a little bit? Globalists had done so much damage to the word in associating it with imperialism, xenophobia, and narrow-mindedness that it took Yorom's vigorous defense of the word to reclaim its now obvious virtues, to stay the course. We met another great founder of Colin Moran, who's at the front table, that was a big early donor. And in March 2019, Chris DeMuth agreed to chair a new conference to convene smart scholars and leaders over the term national conservatism. The first conference in 2019 were a few hundred attendees, and it was convened in a certain way. Yoram made the wise choice with Chris and others to refuse admission to attendees from the far right. By the way, none of us today would qualify to have been able to attend under the New York Times definition of far right. But we use kind of a normie definition of far right, which really just kept the real crazies out. The goal was to convene a big enough tent to encompass diverse strands of conservative nationalists, but also to begin to define what that actually is, at least in America. Last night, Vivek talked about what he called national libertarian versus national protectionist. Whether the instinctive drawing of circles that we all do on the Venn diagram either pull us apart or show us alignment, an important impression I've had over the years is that the area of overlap of these circles is getting larger, better defined, and better understood among all of us. For example, Vivek's definition of libertarian, even Vivek's definition, is substantially different than it might have been a few years ago. What my friend and original co-investor Colin also pointed out as we've thought about the tone this particular conference was how much more people have a sense about what national conservatism really is. And that doesn't come without history and tradition and engagement. Another goal we had was to earn legitimacy. It was hard that first year because no one knew exactly what crazy stripes might be able to be painted on any of us hapless attendees, especially those with political aspirations. But Chris and Yoram made this happen with integrity, rigor, and mutual respect. That's so refreshing these days. No one at the conference had to get into a debate to rebut Jane, you ignorant slut, with Dan, you pompous ass. My apologies to younger NatConners and those without 50 years memories of Saturday Night Live. Josh Hawley was the only senator at NatCon 1. Kudos to him for his wisdom and foresight. He took a chance. J.D. Vance was not senator yet, but he was there at NatCon 1. And even NatCon 2 took courage for Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz to come and speak, because it wasn't clear what we really were. And now we have 8 confirmed senators. Still, after the first year, it was clear that the high-level conceptual national conservatism did not do enough to distinguish what is meant by that label, what positions in philosophy was inside and what was outside of NatCon's outer perimeter. Hence, Yoram led a convening of the most influential participants from the first NatCons to elaborate its first statement of principles. Another important early debate was whether NatCon should be focused only on the USA, which from a kind of a business strategic sense makes sense to stay focused, or should be more international itself. It's a bit of a challenging question because the very basis of nationalism is an acceptance that what works one place doesn't necessarily work in another. And something that called the Edmund Burke Foundation cannot necessarily wisely suggest principles for India, except at a very high level. We represent a more restrained vision of what is universal and what is national. Our opponents have a very hard time with this nuance because their very starting point is this universalist view, and the humans are bound ultimately to organize around their narrow view. As a close observer of Hungary, I understood that we in the USA could ourselves better understand nationalism by understanding Hungary's unique position as a small and very distinctive country that wished to preserve its distinctiveness. But we could much more easily observe the forces at work to destroy Hungarian culture and learn lessons from its struggle than perhaps in our own country. So it's only fair that we learn from them, because a Hungarian George Soros has spread so much damaging thoughts and activity to our country. But in fact, the first foreign language in which virtue of nationalism was translated was Hungarian. American conservatives have since learned from Hungary that the forces which act to corrode a distinctive culture can be fought, even while acknowledging that American traditions and culture are very different and will not necessarily be fought in exactly the same way. The case of engagement between the Tory party and NatCon is also instructive. I first realized that the Tory party itself could be in trouble when one of their members was crucified after attending Rome NatCon in 2019. The Tory establishment boycotted national conservatism for years. Now, this is crazy because the Tory success came from putting together the working class coalition that Trump had already demonstrated in the USA. Of course, that changed with NatCon's 2023 conference, but the canary had already sung in that coal mine, as we have learned. NatCon has been the victim and not the advocate for authoritarianism. Afraid of NatCon's responsible and intellectual advocacy, left has often tried to prevent these events from even occurring. Many venues have been unfriendly, which in 2021 required a temporary move away from DC to the free state of Florida. But not, of course, at a Disney hotel. We're all well aware of the even more determined effort to cancel NatCon in Brussels. Finally, it is obvious that NatCon has been the leading intellectual edge of a global but national phenomenon. The high mobility of people and products both add to the various calculations of overall material wealth and threaten to corrode national security and cultural wealth. Economic and non-economic values have not been wisely balanced around the world, partly because there has not been a well-understood virtue of nationalism to preserve a sustainable balance between these two sources of wealth. Leave it to the left and not to us to dismiss non-material values. How clueless do you have to be to think that a person of modest means will willingly give up his cultural wealth, his notion of masculinity, his pride of country, his admiration of national heroes, his God, etc., etc. How foolish is it to think that Americans cannot both acknowledge injustices of the past and be working to make America an even better and be grateful for America's unrelenting greatness? But this is indeed the powerful foolishness that we fight and will defeat. I'd leave you with my two hopes for NatCon's future. One, I hope that it continues to convene great people like the people in this room for the ongoing rediscovery of conservatism, both drawn from our past and with respect to lessons for the ongoing challenges of the future. And second, I hope that the NatCon framework that is so useful in the United States and some European nations will continue to be embraced by national conservative leaders in other nations of the world. The statement of principles, of course, must be adjusted for national circumstance, but I'm not too worried about the Edmund Burke Foundation deciding it must become an imperial power. Thank you for supporting NatCon. Like you all, I look forward to the future because of my respect for and gratitude for the past.